Well, this morning, Pastor Kyle is out today. He was away this week at a meeting in Indianapolis, and that involves some early morning and late night flights. So he is not here today. He'll join us again next week. So we're going to continue this morning in this series that we've started called The Way of Jesus. We're spending this fall exploring together what it means to practice the way of Jesus. And we're talking about some really specific, really practical ways to do that. Practices that we can include in our daily lives that will shape us to be more and more like Jesus. And we're not doing these things because, we just think they're a good idea or it's some moral exercise or anything like that. We are practicing these things. We're doing them because Jesus did them. And if we're going to be apprentices of Jesus, if we're going to become like him and learn from him, then we need to do the things that he did. So Pastor Kyle last week taught about the practice of Sabbath, just one of the most life-giving practices that we can take on. I encourage you, if you have not had the opportunity to hear that sermon, to go back and listen to that. It's available on our website. You won't regret hearing that teaching. And then today we're going to look at another practice that was really prominent in Jesus' life, and that is the practice of solitude. So let's first take a moment and ask the Lord to guide us this morning. Holy Spirit, as we open the scriptures this morning and hear from your word, would you help us to understand what we hear? Would you help us to set aside our distractions, to turn our attention toward you, and to open our hearts to what you have for us to hear today? Thank you for being our helper. Amen. I wonder how many of you ever check the activity report on your phone? Did you know you can do that? Did you? This might be bad news. Did you know, depending on what kind of phone you have, that there's a daily report in your settings that will tell you things like how many times you picked up your phone, how many notifications you received, how much time you spent on any given app? It's horrifying. Recent surveys show that most Americans pick up their phones somewhere between 80 and 140 times a day. I checked my own report yesterday, and I found that I received, on average, 45 notifications on my phone that pop up on my phone every day over the last week. And I have email notifications turned off on my phone. So that's not email, that's just other stuff. If you've never looked at your activity report, I will cautiously encourage you to do so. It can be quite eye-opening. As a culture, we have become addicted to our phones and our devices. A few years ago, a psychologist at NYU conducted this study where he asked people if, hypothetically, would they rather have their phone broken or have a bone in their hand broken? And the clarifying question that they asked back before they could give an answer, the question was, well, if my hand is broken, can I still use my phone? That's what they were worried about. And almost 50% of them ended up saying that they'd rather have their hand broken than have their phone broken. What is this power that digital technology has over us? It's the power of distraction. Distraction has been a temptation and a struggle for humans since the beginning. But we happen to live in an age where this whole age is characterized by distraction and by the twin of distraction, which is hurry. Do you feel this in your life? Do you experience a regular sense of being distracted from the relationships and the things that are important to you? Do you always feel like you're in a hurry, hard-pressed to get everything done, to meet all the expectations? You ever just get the feeling that daily life has just become too much and wonder if this is really the way that things are supposed to be? Well, we can take comfort in knowing that Jesus experienced the weight and the temptation of distraction and hurry too. I mean, he didn't carry a distraction machine in his pocket like we do, but he certainly lived with demands on his time and on his attention. The Bible tells us that Jesus can empathize with us because he experienced all the same temptations that we experience. And let's understand this. Distraction and hurry are temptations. They're not inevitabilities. It's not just our fate. It may be hard for us to live in a way that's not subject to distraction and hurry in our current culture, but it is possible. There is another way, and that is the way of Jesus. In the way of Jesus, the cure for distraction and hurry is a practice of solitude. Jesus practiced solitude regularly. The Gospel of Luke describes this in Luke 5:16. It says, "But Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed." Now, when you think about the activities that characterize the life of Jesus, I don't know what comes to mind. Maybe it's the way that he healed the sick, or his miracles, walking on water, feeding 5,000 people with a little bit of fish and bread, turning water into wine. Maybe we think of his teachings like the Sermon on the Mount. But would it surprise you to hear that one of the most consistent themes of Jesus' life, one that is emphasized by all of the gospel writers, was solitude? That over and over and over again in the Gospels, we see Jesus withdrawing from people and from demands and from responsibilities to be alone with God, his Father. Mark chapter 1, the Gospel of Mark, gives us a glimpse of a day in the life of Jesus. And the day that we see, it was a Sabbath day, which if you heard last week's sermon, no, that's just a day of rest. So it's a Sabbath day. So first, Jesus taught in the synagogue. Remember, he was a rabbi, a teacher. First, he taught in the synagogue, and then he freed a man of an evil spirit. Then he went to Peter's house, probably for Sabbath dinner, and while he was there, he learned that Peter's mother-in-law was sick, so he healed her. And when the people heard about these things that he had been doing all day, they, that evening, when the Sabbath was over, they brought all of the sick people, all of the people who were tormented by evil spirits, and brought them to Jesus, and he went to work, and he started healing them. That was in one day of Jesus' ministry, a Sabbath day, a day of rest. That's a day of rest. But then Mark tells us that the next day, it says in Mark 1:35, very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place where he prayed. I don't know about you, but after a day like that, I'd probably sleep in the next morning, and that's not what Jesus did. Over and over again, Jesus left the crowds and the needs and the demands and the expectations, and he went to a solitary place, and there he prayed. Solitude is where we find the space to be with God. It's where distractions are silenced and a hurry is stilled. Solitude is essential to the Christian life. I think it's important here for us to consider what solitude is and what solitude is not. Because sometimes we think of that word solitude as a synonym for isolation or for loneliness or aloneness. That's not what it is. Isolation involves emptiness. In isolation, we are disconnected from others, maybe from ourselves, and from God. It's lonely. Isolation is a significant problem in our world today, and it's tied very directly to our distraction. Last year, the U.S. Surgeon General published an 82-page report that said that isolation and loneliness are an epidemic that can have the same effect on our lifespan as would smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Isolation is emptiness. But solitude is fulfillment. In solitude, we intentionally set aside space in our lives to be attentive to God. We intentionally turn away from the distractions of our lives and we slow our pace, maybe to full stop, so that our souls can awaken to the presence of God. God is always present. God is always near. But in our distracted and hurried lives, we can miss him. Isolation is emptiness. Solitude is fulfillment. Isolation disconnects us. Solitude connects us. Isolation happens when distraction and hurry seep into our souls, and solitude brings an inner stillness and a peace. But that stillness, that peace of solitude, it doesn't come on its own. It doesn't just show up out of the blue one day. It's not something that we naturally mature to without being intentional. The practices of Jesus, of the way of Jesus, they are practices. They are things that we do. They're actions. They're intentional. Think for just a moment about somebody that you know, somebody in your life or who you have met who really embodies that stillness, that peace. Someone who lives in a non-anxious way. And when you're with them, you just get that feeling that they are so present with you, that you have their full attention. They move in this unhurried manner. They're sensitive to the small joys and the small sorrows of life. Have you ever been around somebody who just radiates that kind of peace? That didn't happen by accident. They've been formed that way through small habits and small decisions over a long period of time, day by day, shaped into that way of Jesus. Just like Sabbath, solitude nourishes our souls in slowness. It reminds us that we are made for something other than hustle and hurry. As we practice solitude, we will begin to see a depth in our lives. Depth that can't be formed by sound bites or by captions or bullet points. Depth comes from a sustained attentiveness and from a curiosity that is just not in a hurry to be resolved. From listening for connection rather than for correction. It's slow. Formation is slow. Apprenticeship is slow. Practices are slow work. And all of these practices that we've been talking about for the last few weeks, prayer and Sabbath and solitude, they all invite us into that slowness. They invite us to linger with God. Some of you may know that Pastor Kyle is something of a coffee connoisseur. He's not here, so I'm definitely going to use him in an illustration. Pastor Kyle really appreciates a good cup of coffee. And in the family room around the corner here, we have a little coffee station set up there's a Keurig in there. That's a single serving machine, a coffee machine that is just really easy to use. You put your cup under the spout, you put this little prepackaged pod of coffee in the machine, you press a button, and about 45 seconds later, you have a cup of coffee. Really convenient, really fast. Well, Pastor Kyle's reaction to that setup, I'll paraphrase, but it was basically, ew. Not his thing. So now if you go into that room, you'll see the Keurig is still there, but he's also set up this pour-over coffee station. I don't know if you're familiar with this method of making coffee, but it is something. There's a coffee grinder, there's a digital scale. The people who have worked here, I'm seeing the former coworkers who are like, I'm not kidding, this is a big deal. This setup, this coffee grinder and a pour-over carafe and filter and a hot water kettle and a digital scale, because we have to be really exact here. So the process, if you're a barista, just plug your ears, I'm going to get something wrong. But as I understand it, the process here is first you have to calibrate the scale. That's important in making coffee, right? And then you take your whole bean coffee and you grind it, and then you very carefully measure an exact amount by weight of coffee into the filter. And then you gently pour just a small amount of boiling water over the coffee to an exact weight again. And then you just let that sit for a little bit. That's supposed to make the coffee bloom and bring out the full flavor. I don't know what it means for coffee to bloom, but that's what I'm told happens. And you do that, and then you take a few more minutes to slowly pour the rest of the water. I mean, you take minutes to pour 6 ounces of water. Except we don't measure it in ounces, we're measuring it in grams because we're being fancy. It's a whole process. It is complex, and compared to the Keurig, it just takes forever. But it is a good cup of coffee. I mean, I have to admit, it is a really good cup of coffee that results from this process. And Pastor Kyle thinks I ruin it then by putting cream in it, but it's really good. This slow process, it yields excellent results. And I have found that when I take the time to make the good coffee, I savor those results because of the time and the intentionality that went into it. Not only is the coffee itself good, but the process is good. It's a coffee break. You'll remember coffee breaks? The instant machine, it might produce this quick jolt of caffeine that sort of artificially boosts productivity for a little while, but the slower process invites me to step out of the hurry and the hustle of the day. The benefit is in the result and in the process. And that's true for solitude as well. It invites us to step out of this cycle of productivity and achievement and into a place of attentiveness and peace. We've talked about how the practices of Jesus are active, how they're things that we do, that we're intentional about. Well, in solitude, what we're doing is intentionally saying, I'm going to stop doing all of those other things for a time. I'm going to stay here. I'm going to be quiet. I'm going to be still. When you regularly practice solitude, you will see fruit from it. We use that word, fruit, a lot in the church. Maybe you've heard that. Maybe it sounds a little odd. You're like, man, these people are really, really into fruit. We use fruit as a metaphor a lot because the Bible uses fruit as a metaphor to refer to those things that our lives yield, the results of the things that we do and the things that God does in us. Life with attentiveness to the presence of God will bear particularly sweet and abundant fruit. The Bible calls it the fruit of the Spirit. It's love and joy and peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And solitude is the practice that trains us in the attentiveness that we need so that our lives can bear that good fruit. As we grow in this practice, we will start to notice some changes. You'll start to see a change in your life. You may notice that things that used to irritate you just don't anymore. You may find that you pick up on a coworker's sadness or worry, even when they're trying not to show it. You may be less amused by cheap humor, less satisfied with gotcha comebacks. You might start to see changes in your Netflix watch list or your Instagram follows or your to-be-read pile. Your external circumstances might not change at all, but you will start to recognize an inner stillness and a peace that is just not dependent on your circumstances. Jesus is a good teacher. Remember, Jesus was a rabbi, and his disciples were his apprentices. And so he taught them how to practice his ways. So while we see Jesus practicing solitude in his own life, we also see him teaching his disciples how to do the same. We read earlier in Mark 1 about Jesus' full day of ministry and how after that day he withdrew to be with God, his Father. Well, a little bit later in Mark chapter 6, there's this parallel story. Jesus sent his disciples out to nearby towns to practice the ministry that they were in training for. And so the disciples went out in pairs, and they were preaching, and they were freeing people from evil spirits. They were healing the sick. All of those same things that we saw Jesus do a few chapters earlier. It's what his disciples were doing. And then they came back and they told Jesus about it. And I imagine that they were pretty excited. I mean, this is like first solo flight without an instructor. This is an exciting day. I'll bet they couldn't wait to tell Jesus about it. Like, Jesus, we're back. We did it. We told everyone we met to repent and turn to God. We cast out evil spirits, and it worked. We healed the sick. We did it. What a great day. And this is how Jesus responded. In Mark 6, verses 30 and 31, it says, "The apostles returned to Jesus from their ministry tour and told him all they had done and taught. Then Jesus said, 'Let's go off by ourselves to a quiet place and rest a while.'" Notice that when Jesus retreated in solitude, he went alone so he could be with God, his Father. And when he invited his disciples into solitude, he invited them to go with him, because to be in the presence of Jesus is to be in the presence of God. Jesus invited his disciples, his apprentices, to a quiet place where they could rest in his presence. And he invites us to that same place, because we're also his apprentices. We are also learning from Jesus. He knows the pressures and the temptations of our lives. He knows the pull of distraction that we face every day. And he invites us to learn from him, to watch how he does it, and then to do the same. Jesus invites us into solitude with him. Well, how do we do this in our current culture and lives? Well, there are a lot of ways that we could practice solitude, but we have to start where we are. If you're in either of the small groups that are going through the Practicing the Way course, then you've heard on the video teaching of those groups that the only way that we can practice the way of Jesus is within the context of our daily lives, because that's all we have. So we have to start right where we are. And this is how I would suggest starting a practice of solitude. Create little solitudes in your life. Pastor Kyle and I think, have both mentioned before Richard Foster. He's a pastor and writer that we both really respect. Richard Foster wrote a book called Celebration of Discipline about spiritual practices. And when he wrote that, his advice on how to practice solitude was to take advantage of the little solitudes that fill our day. But he wrote those words about 50 years ago. And today, most of the daily little solitudes have been swallowed up by our phones and by our schedules. We don't have them anymore. So we're going to start a little bit farther back. This is how we start a practice of solitude. We will create little solitudes in our day. And here's what I mean by that. This week, while you're waiting, notice when you're waiting for something. You might be waiting for your coffee order or for a doctor's appointment, for your ride to show up, whatever it is. But if you're waiting, don't pick up your phone. Just resist that temptation to pick up your phone. As I was walking in this morning from the bottom of the parking lot, put my bag over my shoulder and I locked my car, and I immediately picked up my phone from my pocket to walk in. I noticed that. What am I doing? Don't pick up your phone. Don't turn on a podcast or an audiobook in those moments. Just be there and wait. And just do nothing while you wait. You might notice that you feel bored or anxious or that you get a little fidgety. That's okay. Those things can't hurt us. We don't need to be afraid of them. Just be there. And as you wait and experience that discomfort or that awkwardness, just take that awareness as an opportunity to be attentive to God. You might repeat a scripture that you know. You might repeat this phrase from Psalm 46, verse 10. This will be familiar to many of you. It's the Lord speaking, and he says, "Be still and know that I am God." So as you're waiting in those moments, it might be just 30 seconds, it might be 10 minutes. In those moments, just wait and be still. And let yourself remember to be still and know that God is God. And that's it. Just start there. Just start by creating little moments of solitude this week and use them to turn your attention to God in that moment. Just start there. Worship team, would you come on back up? You know, we don't have to go to a silent retreat, to a monastery, to live off grid in order to find solitude, as great as those things might be. We can start the practice of solitude right where we are, right in our real lives, because real life is the only context that we have. Solitude will reorient our souls from hurriedness and distraction to peace and stillness. And Jesus invites us to go into that quiet place with him where we can rest for a while. And doesn't that just sound wonderful? Let's close in prayer together.